When I think back to 2016, I can't believe how sending $500 to help with a sick grandmother turned into losing $215,000. I never saw myself as the kind of man who would hand over his entire retirement to a woman's family I'd never met. I was cautious, practical, always the one who read the fine print. But it turns out, even the most careful people can get swept into something they don't understand. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't even particularly lonely. But I had $240,000 saved up and thought that would be enough to give me a comfortable retirement after years of working 70-hour weeks and living in a studio apartment to build that nest egg. The thing that gets me, even now, is how reasonable every single request seemed at the time. A grandmother needed surgery. A nephew needed school fees. The roof was leaking during typhoon season. A brother lost his job. Every single one of these things, taken individually, made perfect sense. It was only when I sat down years later and added it all up that I realized I'd been funding an entire extended family's lifestyle while thinking I was just being a decent human being. I was 67 years old when it all came crashing down, old enough to know better, but apparently not wise enough to see what was happening right in front of me. And the worst part? I saw other expats going through the exact same thing while I was there. And I remember thinking to myself, at least I'm not that guy. Turns out I was exactly that guy. I just didn't know it yet. I was 63 when I finally pulled the trigger on early retirement. I'd spent 42 years in civil engineering, mostly infrastructure projects, mostly in Colorado where I'd lived since my 20s. I felt like I was pretty boring, really. Same apartment for 15 years, same routine, same dive bar on Fridays, same hiking trails on weekends when I had the energy. I had $240,000 saved up. It wasn't a fortune, but I felt good about it. I'd sold my small condo 2 years earlier when the market was high, made a decent profit, and combined with my 401k and some stock investments that had done well, I was sitting on what I thought was enough. My plan was to stretch it for another 20 years, supplement with Social Security when that kicked in at 67, and live modestly but comfortably. Maybe travel a bit. Maybe finally learn to play guitar. Nothing extravagant. I got married back in 1979. We went on to have 2 kids, both girls. It was fine for the first decade, but somewhere around 1,992 things started falling apart. She wanted different things than I did. I was focused on work, on building security, on making sure we had enough. She said I was never present, always at the job site, always tired. The divorce was finalized in 1995, and it was nasty. She got the house, I got the debt, and I lost contact with my daughters for years because of how bitter everything became. By the time 2013 rolled around, I was 60 and completely alone. My daughters had their own lives on the East Coast. I hadn't had a serious relationship in over a decade. I'd heard people talk about the Philippines, how the cost of living was lower, how life could be easier, and how a man could start fresh. I let myself believe it because I wanted something like that to be true so badly. A buddy from work had retired to Thailand a few years earlier and kept sending me photos of beaches and cheap beer and smiling people. He said Southeast Asia was where Americans could actually live well on a modest retirement, not scraping by in some depressing apartment complex in Florida. I started researching in early 2015. I looked at cost of living calculators, expat forums, YouTube videos. The Philippines kept coming up as friendly, English-speaking, and affordable. I could rent a nice place for $300 a month. I could eat out for $2. I could live like I mattered for once, instead of being invisible. By the time October 2015 came around, I started thinking, why was I even staying in Colorado? I could retire early. I had enough saved. I had nothing waiting for me in Denver except another cold winter and another year of the same nothingness. I could live in the Philippines on the money I had. I could have a nice place, a relationship with someone who actually appreciated me, and I could be respected for once, instead of being just another lonely old man watching TV alone every night. So I made the decision. I'd move to the Philippines. I'd make my money last, and I'd finally have the life I'd worked 42 years to earn. I joined a dating site in the Philippines in November 2015. I think it was Filipino Cupid or something like that, but it was clear that there were more girls on there than guys, and it was quite interesting to receive messages from girls in their 20s and 30s saying they wanted a serious relationship with someone just like me. I got it that they came from a poor background and needed financial support. I get they wanted a better life, but I wanted a better life as well. And by being with someone like that, I thought I would have a better life. I wasn't naive about it. I knew money was part of the equation, but I thought if I was upfront about my situation, if I set boundaries early, if I was careful about who I chose, I could find something genuine within those parameters. Before long, I started talking to one girl who was from Leyte province. She was only 22 years old at the time, but it was as if she completely looked past my age and appearance and looked at who I was inside as a person. Her name was Tessalyn. Her profile said she was a caregiver for her elderly aunt, helping her family, studying part-time to get a nursing degree. She seemed ambitious but grounded, sweet but not overly flattering. We started chatting every day. She'd message me in the morning, which was evening for me, and we'd talk for hours. She asked about my work, my life, what I wanted from retirement. She told me about Leyte, about growing up in a small barangay outside Tacloban, about how Typhoon Yolanda had destroyed so much in 2013 and her family was still recovering. She told me about her aunt who had diabetes and couldn't work anymore, how Tessalyn was taking care of her while trying to save money for school. It felt real. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't pushing. She just seemed interested in me as a person, which was something I hadn't felt in years. We talked about movies, about food, about what it was like living in different parts of the world. She laughed at my jokes. She remembered things I told her. She asked follow-up questions about my daughters, even though that was a painful subject. After about 2 months of daily conversations, I told her I was planning to visit the Philippines in early 2016. I was going to stay in Manila for a bit, see the country, and if things went well, maybe we could meet in person. She was excited but also nervous. She said she'd never met anyone from a dating site before, that she was worried I wouldn't like her in person, that she was just a simple provincial girl and didn't know if she was what I was looking for. That vulnerability, that humility, it made me want to meet her even more. I told her I wasn't looking for someone perfect. I was looking for someone genuine, someone kind, someone who wanted to build something real, even if it wasn't conventional. It only took me 3 months to decide to go and see her. I booked a ticket for February 2016, arranged a month-long stay, and told myself I was just exploring. No commitments, no big decisions, just seeing if what we had online translated to real life. Looking back now, I can see how carefully it was all constructed, but at the time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When I called my daughter Sarah and told her that I met someone online and she's actually younger than you, I could hear her sigh as if to say, "Here we go." But I didn't care, and life felt exciting for the first time in years. She asked me if I was sure I knew what I was doing, if I'd thought this through, if I understood that women in poor countries sometimes see older American men as a way out. I told her I appreciated her concern, but I was a grown man and I could handle myself. My buddy from work, the one who'd retired to Thailand, was even more blunt when I told him. He said, "Vincent, I'm telling you this because I care about you. Be very careful with the family. The girl might be great, but the family will bleed you dry if you let them. Set boundaries from day one and stick to them. I've seen it happen to a dozen guys out here." I told him I appreciated the advice, but Tessalyn wasn't like that. She'd never asked me for anything. She had her own life, her own responsibilities. I wasn't some ATM machine she was targeting. We had a genuine connection. I felt that. Part of me knew what the game was in the Philippines, and part of me had already come to the conclusion that Tessalyn probably needed financial help eventually. But I chose to ignore it because I wanted to believe in something. I wanted to believe that someone could care about me, even if money was part of the equation. I wanted to believe I could help someone and be appreciated for it, instead of being taken advantage of. That was my first mistake, but it wouldn't be my last. For the first month after I arrived in Manila in February 2016, everything was exactly what I'd hoped for. We met in person for the first time at a mall in Makati, and she was even more beautiful than her photos. She was nervous, shy, barely made eye contact at first. We had coffee, walked around, talked for hours. There was no pressure, no agenda. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't even let me pay for her lunch the first day. She insisted on splitting it, said she didn't want me to think she was only interested in my money. That gesture, as small as it was, meant everything to me at the time. It made me trust her. We spent almost every day together after that. I was staying in a serviced apartment in Makati, paying about $800 a month, which I thought was steep but acceptable for the location and amenities. Tessalyn would take the bus from her aunt's place in Quezon City, over an hour each way, just to spend the day with me. We'd go to malls, to parks, to restaurants. I found myself falling for her more than I expected. She was sweet, attentive, and she made me feel young again. After dating for about 6 weeks, that's when we decided to take things further. Her aunt's place was too far, and she was spending so much time and money on transportation just to see me. It only made sense for her to move into my apartment. I told her she didn't have to work while we figured things out, that I could support us both while she focused on her nursing studies. She was working part-time at a small clinic, making around 8,000 pesos a month, which was less than $200. I agreed to give her 15,000 pesos a month for personal expenses, about $300, so she could have her own money and not feel dependent. I felt like this was a fair amount, and it allowed her to maintain some independence while we built our relationship. I was happy to make those changes because a part of me always was looking for a connection and to have someone to go home to in the evenings. We'd cook together, watch movies, walk around the city. She taught me basic Tagalog phrases. I taught her about American culture, about my work, about the places I'd traveled. She was curious, engaged, and she seemed genuinely interested in building a life together. After we had been together for about 4 months, living together for 2, I had to pull the trigger and ask her to marry me. I wanted to take things further with her, and I felt like she would want the same, which she did. We got married in a small civil ceremony in Manila in July 2016. No big wedding, no family drama, just us, 2 witnesses, and a government official. She cried happy tears. I felt like I'd finally done something right with my life. My daughters didn't come. Sarah sent a polite message saying she hoped I was happy. My other daughter, Jennifer, didn't respond at all. I told myself it didn't matter. They had their own lives. This was mine. What I didn't realize at the time was that getting married changed everything. Before we were married, Tessalyn never asked for anything from me. She was happy and content just being able to spend time together, explore Manila, build our relationship. But when we were married, I could feel like she was more comfortable, but not comfortable in a positive way, comfortable in a negative way, like the performance was over and the real work was about to begin. The first request came about 3 weeks after our wedding. Her grandmother in Leyte was sick and needed medicine. It was $500, not a huge amount, but more than she'd ever asked for before. I sent it without hesitation. It seemed like the right thing to do. She was my wife now. Her family was my family. That's what marriage meant, right? I had no idea that $500 would turn into $215,000 over the next 2 years. I had no idea that I'd just opened a door I'd never be able to close. After things went smoothly for about 6 months after our wedding, it only seemed logical to start thinking about the future more seriously. We were living in Manila, but Tessalyn kept talking about Leyte, about how much she missed her province, about how peaceful it was compared to the chaos of the city. She said her dream was to eventually move back, to have a house there, to be near her family as they got older. One thing kept coming back to me was how cheap everything was outside Manila. I'd done some research on property prices in the Visayas region, and you could buy land for a fraction of what it cost in the city. I started thinking about it as an investment, but also as a retirement plan. If we had a house in Leyte, we could live there eventually, keep our expenses low, and my money would last much longer. In December 2016, we flew to Tacloban for Christmas to visit her family. It was my first time meeting them in person. Her mother, her 2 younger brothers, her aunt, a dozen cousins. They were warm, welcoming, called me Kuya Vincent, like I was already part of the family. They prepared a feast, gave me the best seat, treated me like I was someone important. It felt good to be respected like that. During that trip, Teslin started talking more seriously about the possibility of buying land and building a house. She showed me plots of land available for sale near her family's barangay, about 30 minutes outside Tacloban. The area was rural, but not completely isolated. There was a paved road most of the way, electricity, water access. It seemed that the owner was very eager to sell because they needed money quickly to pay off a debt. We went to look at the land. It was about 500 square meters, near a river, with coconut trees and a view of the hills. It was beautiful, honestly, quiet, green, the kind of place I'd imagined when I thought about retiring somewhere peaceful. The asking price was $12,000. Teslin said that was a fair price for that size and location, maybe even a good deal. I hesitated. $12,000 wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't a huge amount in the grand scheme of things. I'd already spent about $15,000 on our wedding, apartment, and daily expenses since moving to the Philippines. I still had over $200,000 in the bank. I thought if we bought the land now, we could build slowly over time, budget carefully, and have a place to retire in a few years. We bought that land in January 2017 for $12,000. It went into Teslin's name because, as a foreigner, I wasn't allowed to own land in the Philippines. That was something that really annoyed me because I felt like if I could have done everything properly in my own name, things may have turned out better. But we were married. What was hers was mine, legally speaking. That's what I told myself. Once we owned the land, the next conversation was about building. Teslin said we should at least start the foundation and basic structure before the rainy season came. She introduced me to a contractor her uncle knew, someone who'd built several houses in the area. He seemed professional enough, gave us a quote for a basic 2-bedroom house with a bathroom, kitchen, and living area. Our budget was $75,000 for the build. For that, we'd get a concrete foundation, hollow block walls, a metal roof, basic finishes, nothing fancy, but solid and functional. The contractor said it would take about 8 months to complete if weather cooperated and materials arrived on time. I sold $40,000 worth of my stock investments to cover the initial construction costs. The plan was to pay in stages as the work progressed, which the contractor agreed to. Teslin's brother would oversee the construction since we were still living in Manila most of the time. He'd send us photos, give us updates, make sure things were moving forward. The first few months seemed okay. I'd see photos of the foundation being poured, walls going up, the roof structure being built. It looked legitimate. Teslin was excited, constantly talking about decorating, about which furniture we'd buy, about how her family could visit and stay in the guest room. But around month 4, the requests started coming. The contractor needed more money for materials because prices had gone up. There was an issue with the septic system that required additional work. The electrical wiring was more complicated than expected. Each time, it was another $2,000, another $3,000, another $5,000. I should have thought I looked for someone else. But Teslin said the contractor was trustworthy, that these things just happen in construction, that if we brought in someone new, it would cost even more to fix what was already done. I didn't know enough about Philippine construction to argue, so I kept sending money. By month 8, I'd spent $85,000 on the house, $73,000 on construction, and $12,000 on the land. I'd blown past my original $75,000 budget by $10,000, but Teslin assured me we were almost done. Just a few finishing touches, some paint, the bathroom fixtures, and we'd be ready to move in. I flew to Leyte in September 2017 to see the house in person. It was standing, which was something, but it wasn't finished. The windows didn't have glass yet. The bathroom wasn't tiled. There was no kitchen sink. The paint was patchy. I asked the contractor what happened to all the money I'd sent. He gave me a long explanation about material costs, labor issues, delays. Tesselin translated, smoothed things over, told me we just needed a bit more to finish properly. I gave them another $5,000. That brought my total investment in the Leyte property to $90,000. I told myself that was it, no more. But deep down, I already knew I'd lost control of the situation. About 8 months after we started building the house in Leyte, in March 2018, Tesselin said we should think about income generation. She wasn't working anymore. We were burning through my savings faster than I'd planned, and she felt guilty about not contributing financially. She suggested opening a small business, something simple that could bring in a bit of money each month. Her idea was a sari-sari store in her family's barangay in Leyte. These are the small, convenience stores you see everywhere in the Philippines, selling snacks, drinks, phone load, basic household items. She said her mother could run it. It would give the family something productive to do, and we could earn maybe 5,000 to 10,000 pesos a month profit, which would cover some of our expenses. I looked at it and thought about how low the startup costs seemed. She said we'd need about $20,000 to build a proper structure attached to her mother's house, stock it with inventory, and have enough buffer to keep restocking for the first 6 months. $20,000 didn't seem unreasonable for a business, especially if it generated ongoing income. The thing was, I wanted Tesselin to feel useful, to feel like she was contributing, and I thought if her family had a business to run, maybe the constant requests for money would slow down. Maybe they'd have their own source of income and wouldn't need to rely on me as much. I sold another $25,000 in investments in April 2018 and funded the sari-sari store project. We paid for construction of the store structure, bought shelving and refrigerators, and stocked it with initial inventory. Tesselin's mother was excited. Her younger brother helped with the setup, and for the first month, things seemed promising. They sent me photos of the store opening, neighbors coming to buy things, inventory moving. Tesselin showed me a notebook where her mother tracked sales and expenses. On paper, they were making about 8,000 pesos a month in profit, which was more than I expected. But after about 3 months, the profits started declining. First it was 6,000, then 4,000, then 2,000. When I asked what was happening, Tesselin said her mother was giving too much credit to neighbors who weren't paying back. She said people in the province have a culture of utang, borrowing with promises to pay later, but those promises rarely materialized. I suggested they stop giving credit, but Tesselin said you can't do that in a small community without offending everyone and losing all your customers. It was a cultural thing I wouldn't understand as a foreigner. So the store kept losing money, and every few months I'd send another 2,000 to restock inventory that had been given away on credit. By the end of 2018, I'd invested $45,000 into the sari-sari store, way more than the initial $20,000 budget, and we were barely breaking even on a good month. While the business was slowly failing, the family requests continued to escalate. What started at $500 for grandmother's medicine had become a pattern I couldn't break. In August 2017, her younger brother needed $1,500 for school enrollment fees for a computer programming course. I sent it because education seemed like a worthwhile investment. In November 2017, the roof on her mother's house got damaged during a storm and needed repairs. $3,000. In February 2018, her aunt's diabetes medication became too expensive and she needed help. $500 a month for 3 months. In June 2018, her cousin's wife had complications during pregnancy and needed a C-section the family couldn't afford. $4,000. Every time, though, she brought it up. I said I was going to say no, but she just kept pushing and pushing. She'd cry, saying I didn't understand how poor her family was, how desperate these situations were, how she'd never ask if it wasn't absolutely necessary. She made me feel like a selfish, rich American who didn't care about human suffering if I refused. I couldn't bear the thought of having a miserable woman next to me ruining my life, so I'd give in. Every single time, I'd give in. Before we were married, Tessalin never asked for anything from me. She was happy and content just being able to explore Manila, plan our future, enjoy simple things. But when we were married, I could feel like she was more comfortable, but not comfortable in a positive way, comfortable in a negative way, like she'd secured her position and now the real extraction could begin. By the time March 2019 rolled around, I sat down and actually calculated what I'd spent since arriving in the Philippines in February 2016. Apartment and living expenses in Manila, approximately $35,000 over 3 years. Land and house construction in Leyte, $90,000. Sari-sari store investment, $45,000. Family emergencies and requests, approximately $20,000 total spent, $190,000. I had $50,000 left in my bank account, maybe. I'd started with $240,000 just 3 years earlier. I told myself I could live on $2,000 a month, which would last me about 2 more years if I was very careful. But within 6 months of setting that budget, it was closer to $3,000 a month. And no matter how many times I looked at the figures, I couldn't explain where it was all going. It was breakdown by category. Apartment rent in Manila, $800 a month. Food and groceries, $400 a month. Tessalin's personal allowance, $300 a month. Utilities and internet, $150 a month. Transportation, $100 a month. Family requests averaging $500 a month minimum. Random emergencies, another $500 a month. That was already $2,700, without including anything unexpected, which there always was. One evening in April 2019, I sat her down and told her it couldn't go on like this, that the budget was $2,000 a month and there was no more. I tried to make it sound firm but fair, and I told her that if we wanted to have any kind of future together, we had to stick to it. She nodded and didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't happy. Her face went cold. She stopped talking to me for 2 days. It was the silent treatment, and it worked because I felt terrible the entire time. Every request after that turned into an argument. Every peso questioned became a fight about how I didn't trust her, how I was treating her like a child, how I was being controlling. I found myself second-guessing whether I was the one being unreasonable. Maybe I was being cheap. Maybe I didn't understand how things worked in the Philippines. Maybe I was the problem. That guilt manipulation was more effective than any direct request ever was. We lived in Makati most of the time, in that same serviced apartment I'd been renting since I arrived. The neighborhood was busy, modern, full of expats and wealthy Filipinos, shopping malls, restaurants, traffic, pollution. It was convenient, but exhausting. I was starting to enjoy it less and less as time went on. But when we went to Leyte every few months, I felt something different. The province was quieter, slower, simpler. The air was cleaner. The house we'd built, despite all the money problems, was actually nice. It had a view of the hills, a small garden Tessalin's mother was starting to plant, space to breathe. When we were there, away from Manila, away from the constant spending pressure, I felt like maybe things could work. One thing I noticed very quickly being in the Philippines was how communal family was. In America, when you turn 18, you're expected to be independent, to make your own way, to not burden your parents or siblings. But in the Philippines, family is everything. What's yours is theirs. Your success is their success. Your money is family money. It's a beautiful concept in theory, but in practice, it meant I was financially responsible for not just Tessalin, but her mother, her brothers, her aunts, her cousins, and anyone else who happened to be related. I tried to learn some Tagalog and Waray, the language they spoke in Leyte. I could say basic things, greet people, order food, count money. Tessalin's family appreciated the effort, even though I was terrible at it. I made expat, friends in Manila, mostly other older American and European guys with Filipino wives or girlfriends. We'd meet for drinks, share stories, complain about the traffic. I heard the same patterns over and over. Bought a house in her name. Family keeps asking for money. Business failed. She changed after marriage. We'd laugh about it, shake our heads, but we all kept doing the same things because what was the alternative? Go back to being lonely in America? At least here we had someone, even if it was complicated. I thought I was managing things better than the other guys. I'd set boundaries. I was tracking my spending. I had a budget. I wasn't naive. But underneath, I already knew I was caught in something I just couldn't pull myself out of. The money was draining faster than I could control. Tessalin was becoming more distant, more demanding, more focused on her family than on us, and I felt isolated, even though I was surrounded by people. I'd wake up some mornings in Manila, look at Tessalin sleeping next to me, and wonder if she actually loved me or if I was just a resource to be managed. I'd push the thought away, tell myself I was being paranoid, remind myself of the good moments we'd had, but the doubt was always there, growing bigger every time another request came, every time another $1,000 disappeared, every time she looked at me like I was an obligation instead of a partner. By July 2019, I'd already spent $190,000. I had $50,000 remaining, maybe less. My original plan was to live on my savings until Social Security kicked in at 67, which was supposed to happen in August 2019. I thought I'd have at least $100,000 in the bank by the time I started receiving Social Security. Instead, I had $50,000, and I was 66 years old with no backup plan. My Social Security payment was going to be $1,800 a month. In the Philippines, that should have been plenty. Most expats I knew lived comfortably on $1,200 to $1,500 a month. But with Tessalin spending, with the family requests, with the ongoing costs of maintaining 2 properties and a failing business, $1,800 wasn't going to cut it. I told myself $2,000 a month would be enough once Social Security started, but within 2 months of receiving my first payment, it was closer to $3,500. And no matter how many times I looked at the figures, I couldn't explain where it was all going. I broke it down one evening in my notebook, trying to make sense of it. Apartment rent in Manila, $800 a month. Utilities, internet, water, $150. Groceries and food, $400. Tessalin's personal allowance, $300. Transportation and gas, $150. Property maintenance and late, $200. Sari store restocking, $300. Family emergencies, average, $600 to $1,000. Miscellaneous and unexpected, $500. That was already $3,400 to $4,400 a month, double what I was bringing in from Social Security, which meant I was still burning through my remaining savings at a rate of $1,500 to $2,500 a month. At that rate, my $50,000 would be gone in less than 2 years. I'd be 68, broke, and stuck in a country where I had no assets in my name, no real safety net, and no way to generate income. One evening in September 2019, I sat her down and told her it couldn't go on like this, that the budget was $2,000 a month total and there was no more. I tried to make it sound firm but fair, and I told her that if we wanted to have any kind of future together, we had to stick to it. She nodded and didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't happy. Her expression changed. She went quiet. For the next week, she barely spoke to me. She'd answer questions with one word. She'd stay in bed later. She'd go out without telling me where. It was punishment for setting a boundary, and it worked because I felt terrible. I started questioning myself. Was I being unreasonable? Other expats I knew were spending more. Maybe I was just being cheap. Maybe this was normal and I was overreacting. Maybe I should just accept that this is what life in the Philippines costs when you have a Filipina wife and her family depending on you. Every request after that turned into an argument. Every time I questioned where money was going, Tessalin would accuse me of not trusting her, of treating her like a child, of being controlling like American men always are. She'd bring up how much she'd sacrificed to be with me, how she could have married someone younger, how she was taking care of me even though I was old and difficult. The guilt worked. I'd find myself apologizing for bringing up money, promising to be more flexible, sending another $1,000 to cover whatever the latest crisis was. In November 2019, her mother called saying the Sari store needed 10,000 pesos immediately to restock or they'd have to close. I sent it, even though I knew it was a losing investment. In December, her brother needed money for Christmas gifts for his kids. I sent 5,000 pesos. In January 2020, her aunt's medication ran out. I sent 8,000 pesos. Every month, there was something, and every month, my 50,000 got smaller and smaller. By February 2020, I had 38,000 left. I'd burned through 12,000 in just 6 months, on top of my Social Security income. I wasn't just losing money, I was losing control, losing dignity, and losing any hope that this was going to end well. Things did change when we hit our 3rd year of marriage in July 2019 in a way I wasn't expecting. Before we were married, Tessalyn never asked for anything from me. She was happy and content just being together. But when we were married for a few years, I could feel like she was more comfortable asking, more entitled, more focused on what I could provide rather than who I was. She stopped asking about my day. She stopped watching movies with me in the evenings. She spent more time on her phone, on video calls with her family, planning trips to Leyte without me. When we'd argue about money, she'd bring up my age, saying I was old-fashioned, that I didn't understand Filipino culture, that I was selfish compared to other foreign husbands she'd heard about who were more generous. In March 2020, when COVID-19 hit and lockdowns started, everything got worse. We were stuck in Manila, in that apartment, together 24/7 with nowhere to go. The malls closed, restaurants closed. We couldn't travel to Leyte. The tension became unbearable. During lockdown, Tessalyn started spending even more time on her phone. She'd lock herself in the bedroom for hours doing video calls. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd say her mother, her friends, her family checking in. But something felt off. She'd get defensive when I walked in during calls. She'd switch to Ware, the language I barely understood, when I was in the room. One afternoon in May 2020, I walked into the bedroom and saw her laptop open with Facebook Messenger on the screen. Before she could close it, I saw a conversation thread with a man's name I didn't recognize. Filipino name, profile picture of a younger guy, maybe early 30s. The messages I could see before she slammed the laptop shut said things like, "I miss you, and when can we meet again?" I asked her who that was. She said it was her cousin. I said that didn't look like cousin conversation. She got angry, accused me of spying on her, said I had no right to look at her private messages. We had a massive fight. She cried, said I was paranoid, that I was accusing her of cheating just because I was insecure about our age difference. I wanted to believe her. I tried to believe her, but the doubt was planted and I couldn't shake it. We had an agreement together that if one of us called the other, we had to pick up straight away. However, after that laptop incident, Tessalyn became very difficult to contact when she'd leave the apartment. She started going out more once lockdowns eased slightly in August 2020, saying she needed to meet friends, needed to get groceries, needed to help her aunt with something. Anytime she went anywhere by herself, she used to answer the phone immediately. But now, calls would go to voicemail. She'd take hours to respond to texts. When she'd finally call back, she'd have excuses. I left my phone in the taxi. The battery died and I couldn't find a place to charge it. I was in the mall and there was no signal in the basement grocery. I was helping a friend and it was rude to be on my phone. Every excuse sounded reasonable individually, but together they formed a pattern. At this point, I'm definitely sure there is something going on, but I didn't have proof, and confronting her without proof just led to more fights, more accusations, that I was controlling and paranoid. The financial requests didn't slow down during COVID. If anything, they increased. Her family in Leyte was struggling because there was no work during lockdown. They needed money for food. They needed money for medicine. They needed money because the sari-sari store had no customers and they couldn't pay their debts. In June 2020, her mother asked for $5,000 to pay off a loan shark who was threatening them. I asked why they had a loan shark debt when I'd been sending money regularly. Tessalyn said they borrowed it before lockdown for house repairs, and now they couldn't pay it back because of COVID. I sent the money because I didn't want her family to be in danger, but I felt sick doing it. I wasn't looking at her the same way anymore. The trust was broken, even if I couldn't prove anything. I felt like a fool, like an ATM machine that could still be manipulated if the right buttons were pushed. The house I'd paid $90,000 for in Leyte didn't feel like mine. The business I'd funded with $45,000 was essentially dead. The relationship I'd invested 3 years of my life into felt like an elaborate performance that I'd paid admission to watch. But I was stuck. I'd burned through most of my savings. I was 67 years old in a foreign country during a pandemic, and I had nowhere else to go. I wasn't looking at her the same way anymore. The trust was broken, even if I didn't have concrete proof. Every interaction felt calculated now. When she'd smile at me, I'd wonder if it was genuine or strategic. When she'd be affectionate, I'd ask myself if she was trying to soften me up for the next request. I felt like I was constantly analyzing, constantly questioning, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was quite friendly with one expat who was in a similar situation, a British guy named Colin who'd married a Filipina from Cebu. We'd have beers on Zoom during lockdown, share stories, commiserate. When I told him I'd put $90,000 into a house in Leyte in my wife's name, I remember him just shaking his head saying, "Mate, you're never seeing that money again if things go south. I hope you know that." I just didn't want to hear it though. Hearing it made it real, and I wasn't ready to face that reality yet. By the time October 2020 rolled around, I had about $32,000 left in the bank. My Social Security covered $1,800 a month, but we were still spending closer to $3,000. I knew I couldn't keep bleeding money anymore. At that rate, I'd be completely broke by my 69th birthday. I tried to have another conversation with Tessalyn about finances in November 2020. I showed her the numbers, explained that we were running out of money, that we had to make serious changes. Her response was cold. She said if I couldn't afford to live in Manila anymore, maybe we should just move to Leyte permanently, live in the house we built. Her family could support us. I didn't trust that plan. Living in Leyte meant being completely dependent on her family, in a house that was in her name, in a province where I barely spoke the language and had no connections. If things fell apart, I'd be trapped with no way out. I suggested an alternative. Maybe she could get a job. She had a nursing background, or at least some training. She could work at a clinic or hospital in Manila. We could share expenses. She looked at me like I'd suggested she start prostituting herself. She said she was a wife, not a workhorse. That taking care of the house and managing the family was her job. That I was the husband and providing financially was my responsibility. That conversation ended badly. She didn't speak to me for 3 days. When she finally did, it was only to tell me her mother needed money for something else. I couldn't believe I'd let this happen. Every day I felt more trapped, more isolated, more aware that I'd made a catastrophic series of decisions, and now I was living with the consequences. The house I paid for didn't feel like mine. The business had failed. My savings were almost gone. And the woman I'd married seemed more interested in extracting every last dollar than in actually being my partner. The worst part was knowing I'd seen the signs and ignored every single one of them. In February 2021, we were planning to go to Leyte. We hadn't been there since before COVID lockdowns started, almost a year. Tessalyn wanted to check on her family, see the house, visit the sari-sari store. I wanted to see where all my money had actually gone because I was starting to seriously doubt the stories I'd been told. The journey was complicated because of pandemic travel restrictions. We had to get COVID tests, fill out health forms, take a ferry from Manila to Tacloban. When we arrived in Leyte, I was looking forward to at least seeing the house finished, seeing some return on the $90,000 I'd invested. But when we got to the barangay and I saw the house, something was immediately wrong. It looked run down. The paint was faded and peeling in places. One of the windows had a crack in it. The gate was rusted. It didn't look like a house that was only 4 years old. It looked neglected. I walked around the property. The garden that Tessalyn's mother was supposedly maintaining was overgrown with weeds. Some of the roof panels looked damaged. Inside, the bathroom tiles were cracked. The kitchen sink I'd paid extra for wasn't even installed properly. It was loose and leaking. What happened here? I asked Tessalin. This doesn't look like a $90,000 house. She said the typhoons had been rough the past few years. Things got damaged. Her family couldn't afford repairs on their own. She'd been meaning to tell me but didn't want to worry me during COVID. I felt my stomach drop. How much would it cost to repair? She estimated maybe $10,000 to get everything back to good condition. I couldn't believe it. I'd already blown my budget by $15,000 on the initial build, and now I needed another $10,000 just to fix damage? Something didn't add up. Then I went to see the Sari store attached to her mother's house. It was closed, shuttered, inventory gone. I asked her mother what happened through Tessalin translating. Her mother said they couldn't keep it running during COVID. Too many people owed them money. Not enough customers. They'd closed it 6 months ago. So where's the inventory? I asked. Where's the refrigerators, the shelving, the equipment? Tessalin said they'd sold some of it to pay debts. The rest was in storage. I did the math in my head. I'd invested $45,000 into that store. Even if they sold the equipment, that was maybe $5,000 in value. Where did the other $40,000 go? That evening, after dinner with her family, I pulled Tessalin aside and asked her directly, I need you to be honest with me. Where did all the money go? $90,000 for the house that looks like this, $45,000 for a store that's closed, $20,000 in family emergencies. That's $155,000 in just investments, not even counting living expenses. I need to know what happened. She got defensive immediately, said I was attacking her family, that I didn't understand how hard things were in the province, that COVID had destroyed everything, that it wasn't her fault. I pushed harder. Before we built the house, you said $75,000 was the budget. Then it became $85,000, then $90,000. Where did that extra $15,000 go? She didn't want to answer at first, but I wouldn't let it go. Finally, she admitted that some of the money went to other things. Her brother needed a motorcycle for work. Her mother needed cataract surgery. Her cousin's house burned down and they needed help rebuilding. So you lied to me, I said. You told me the money was for construction, but it was actually for your family. She started crying, said she didn't lie, that everything was connected, that taking care of family was part of building a life in the Philippines, that I was being cruel for questioning her when she was just trying to help people I claimed to care about. I asked her what was real and what wasn't, and she gave me a partial admission through tears. Maybe $15,000 of the $90,000 actually went into the house. The rest went to family needs, debts, medical bills, helping relatives. The Sari store got maybe $20,000 of the $45,000. The rest was also family expenses. That was a shocking realization. I'd spent 3 years with her at this point, and for a big portion of that time, she'd been lying to me to get money out of me, not for the reasons she said, not for investments, but just to funnel cash to her family while telling me stories about construction delays and business costs. I felt sick. So I paid for your entire family's lifestyle for 3 years while thinking I was investing in our future. She said it was our future, that helping her family meant they'd help us, that this is how things work in the Philippines, that I was too American to understand. I walked away from that conversation knowing I'd been played, completely, systematically played. And the worst part was, I'd let it happen because I was lonely and wanted to believe someone cared about me. The next morning, I told Tessalin I wanted to see documents, land title, construction receipts, store purchase records, bank statements. I wanted proof of where every dollar went. She refused, said it was insulting that I didn't trust her, said the documents were with her brother, with the contractor, with the store supplier, said she couldn't get them right now because of COVID. I knew I'd never see those documents. I knew because they probably didn't exist, or if they did, they'd show exactly what I suspected, that I'd spent $155,000 funding an extended family's expenses while being told elaborate stories about investments and businesses. I told her we needed to go back to Manila immediately. I couldn't stay in Leyte another day. She protested, said we'd just arrived, that her family wanted to spend time with us. I didn't care. I booked bus tickets back to Tacloban and ferry tickets back to Manila for the next day. On the ferry ride back, I did more calculations. 190,000 spent over 5 years. 32,000 remaining. Monthly burn rate still higher than income. I'd be completely broke in less than 2 years at this rate. And I owned nothing. The house was in her name. The store was dead. I had no assets to show for nearly $200,000. I'd been in the Philippines for 5 years and had nothing to show for it except a wife who lied to me and a family that saw me as an ATM machine. By the time March 2021 rolled around, I looked at my account and did the math with complete clarity for the first time. Opening amount. I had started with $240,000 when I moved to the Philippines in February 2016. Itemized losses. Land in Leyte, $12,000. House construction, actual cost, $90,000. Sari store investment, $45,000. Monthly living expenses in Manila, $800 times 60 months equals $48,000. Tesselin's personal allowance, $300 times 48 months equals $14,400. Family emergencies and requests, $28,000. Property repairs and maintenance, $3,600. COVID expenses and loan shark payoff, $5,000. Miscellaneous and unexpected, $10,000. Total spent, $256,000. Wait, that couldn't be right. I'd started with $240,000. How did I spend $256,000? Then I remembered. Social Security. I'd been receiving $1,800 a month since August 2019. That was 18 months at this point. Another $32,400 had come in, and it was all gone too. Total money that had flowed through my hands in 5 years, $272,400 remaining assets. Savings left, $28,000. Property owned, none, all in Tesselin's name. Income, $1,800. Social Security monthly business assets, none. Store closed and equipment sold. What was recoverable? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The house was in her name under Philippine law. The store was closed. The equipment was sold and the money was already spent. The land was in her name. I legally owned 0 assets in the Philippines after spending $250,000. Even if we divorced, even if I fought her in court, I had no claim to any of it. I'd voluntarily put everything in her name because I'd been told that's how it had to work as a foreigner. I'd trusted her because she was my wife. The emotional weight. I'd spent 5 years of my life building what I thought was a future and lost $244,400 over and above what a reasonable retirement budget would have been. What a nightmare it was. The fact that Tesselin had lied to me about where the construction money went instead of just being honest and saying my family needs help, I'd have probably gone along with it. I understood poverty. I understood family obligation. But she went behind my back and basically stole my money for 3 years, feeding me stories about construction delays and business costs while funneling cash to relatives. Everything I paid for was in her name. House in Leyte, worth approximately $40,000, if I was lucky. Land worth approximately $15,000. Sari store, former equipment worth approximately $3,000. Already sold, total value she kept, approximately $55,000 to $60,000. My legal claim, 0, nothing. I had no rights to any of it. Legal situation. I had no claim over any of it other than the fact it belonged to my wife. But did I really want her to be my wife now after what I'd learned? I was 67 years old, had $28,000 in the bank, $1,800 a month in Social Security, no property, no assets, and a wife who'd systematically lied to me for years while extracting every dollar I had. I'd lost everything, and I had no one to blame but myself for being stupid enough to trust her. When we got back to Manila from Leyte in late February 2021, I couldn't even look at Tesselin. Every interaction felt like a performance. When she'd ask what I wanted for dinner, I'd wonder if she was softening me up for another request. When she'd try to cuddle at night, I'd feel my body go rigid. The trust was completely gone. I didn't know if I should just return to America immediately, but then I thought about the logistics. I'd have to find an apartment back in Colorado, probably in a worse neighborhood than where I'd lived before because I couldn't afford anything decent anymore. I'd be living on $1,800 a month Social Security in the United States, which was poverty level. In the Philippines, at least that went further, even if everything else was terrible. But then I'm thinking about the house in Leyte. It was in her name. If I left the Philippines, I'd never see a dime of that investment. If I divorced her, would I have any legal claim? I started researching Philippine divorce laws for foreigners. It was complicated, expensive, and time-consuming. And even if I won, I probably wouldn't get anything back because the assets were in her name by law. I was trapped. Financially, emotionally, legally trapped. In March 2021, I told Tessalyn we needed to talk seriously. I sat her down in the apartment and said, "This isn't working anymore. I know you lied about where the money went. I know the house didn't cost $90,000. I know the store didn't cost $45,000. I know you've been funneling money to your family while telling me it was for investments." She tried to deny it at first. Then she tried to minimize it, saying it was only a little bit here and there. Then she got angry, accused me of being paranoid and controlling. She said I was acting like a typical American who only cared about money and not about people. I told her it wasn't about the money itself. It was about the lying. If she'd been honest from the beginning, we could have worked something out. But she'd lied for years, and I couldn't trust anything she said anymore. She started crying, saying she'd never do it again, that she'd be honest from now on, that she loved me and didn't want to lose me. She tried hugging me, kissing me, promising she'd change. I pulled away. "It's too late, Tessalyn. I've got maybe $28,000 left and I need that to survive. I can't keep doing this." Her crying stopped almost instantly. Her face changed. The mask dropped. She said, "So what, you're just going to leave me with nothing? After everything I've done for you? What have you done for me exactly?" I asked. She listed things: cooking, cleaning, taking care of me, being with me even though I was old, giving up her youth to be my wife. Every item on her list felt transactional, like she'd been keeping a ledger of services rendered and payment owed. I told her I wanted a separation. Not necessarily a divorce yet, but I needed space. I needed to figure out what I was going to do with my life. She could stay in the Manila apartment for now, but I was going to find somewhere else to live. She turned hostile immediately. Said if I left, she'd make sure I never saw any of the property in Leyte. Said her family would make my life hell if I tried to take anything from her. Said she'd go to immigration and report me for something. She'd figure it out. I was too tired to fight. I just said, "Keep it all. I don't care anymore. I just want out." My idea was to find a cheap room somewhere in Manila, live on as little as possible, and figure out my next move. Maybe go back to America eventually when I had enough saved for a plane ticket and a security deposit on an apartment. When she realized I was serious, she finally left me alone. I moved out of the apartment 3 weeks later into a boarding house in Quezon City that cost $300 a month. The boarding house in Quezon City was depressing. A single room with a bed, a small table, a fan, and a shared bathroom down the hall. It reminded me of my first apartment when I was 23, except now I was 67 and this was probably going to be the best I could afford for the rest of my life. Back in this room, I had no choice but to start over from the bottom. My daily budget was now about $50 total for everything. Food, transportation, utilities, everything. I couldn't eat out anymore. I couldn't take taxis. I walked everywhere. I bought the cheapest food at the wet market. I stopped drinking beer because I couldn't afford it. I'm 67 years old, living in a boarding house in one of the worst parts of Quezon City, with only $25,000 in the bank after paying for the separation expenses, and only $1,800 a month to live on. You can't live comfortably on that in Manila. You should be able to, but you can't when you have nothing else. The anger has never left me. and the bitterness stayed in everything I did, and all I could think was that I traded away the last chance I had for something that was never real in the first place. I thought about all the decisions that led me here, joining that dating site, ignoring my daughter's warnings, putting property in her name, funding the sari store when I knew it was a bad idea, sending money every time her family had an emergency. Every single decision was a brick in the wall I'd built around myself. I started working again in mid-2021, just to survive. I found freelance engineering consulting work online, helping companies with CAD drawings and project planning. It paid maybe $500 to $800 a month if I could find consistent clients. Combined with my Social Security, I could get to about $2,500 a month, which was barely enough to live in Manila and save nothing. I always think back to what I did and the time I had there with her. And if only she had been honest about what she needed, instead of lying about construction costs and business investments, things would have turned out like they should have done, and I hate her for it. I hate myself more, but I hate the fact that she destroyed any chance I had at a decent retirement because she was too greedy to just be honest about what her family needed. If she'd said from the beginning, "My family is poor and they need help," I would have set a budget and stuck to it. But she made me think I was investing in our future when really I was just funding her family's lifestyle while getting nothing in return. The house I paid $90,000 for? I'll never see it again. The business I funded? Dead. The relationship? Over. The money? Gone. My retirement? Destroyed. And I'm the idiot who let it all happen. If I could do it over, I would change everything. Never put property in someone else's name. I don't care what the law says about foreigners owning land. If I can't own it myself, I don't buy it, period. The house, the land, everything should have stayed as rental properties, or I shouldn't have invested at all. Set firm financial boundaries from day one and stick to them. I should have said, I can give you $500 a month for family support, and that's it. No emergencies, no exceptions. And then actually enforced it instead of caving every time she cried or gave me the silent treatment. Listen when family and friends warn you. My daughter told me to be careful. My expat friend told me not to fund businesses in her name. Everyone warned me, and I ignored them all because I wanted to believe I'd found something real. Don't ignore red flags. The first time she lied about where money went, I should have ended it. Instead, I made excuses and convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. Keep emergency money completely separate. I should have kept at least $50,000 in a separate account she didn't know about, untouchable for any reason. That would have given me an escape plan when things went bad. Never fund a business in a partner's name unless you can afford to lose it all. The sari store was a $45,000 mistake. I knew it was risky. I did it anyway, and I lost everything. Understand that family obligation works differently in the Philippines. I thought I was marrying one person. I was actually marrying her entire extended family, and they all expected support. If I'd understood that from the beginning, I would have run. The fact that I still have enough to live on barely, that I didn't lose absolutely everything, that I'm not homeless in Manila with nothing, that's got to be good enough for me. I know other expats who lost more. I know guys who ended up with nothing, sleeping on the street, begging other expats for help. At least I still have my Social Security. At least I have a little bit saved. At least I'm healthy enough to work part-time and supplement my income. But I wouldn't wish this on anyone. I'm working at 67 when I should be retired. I'm living in a boarding house when I should have a comfortable place. I'm alone when I thought I'd have a partner. All because I was lonely and stupid enough to believe someone 26 years old actually loved me. I'm still living in Quezon City in that same boarding house. I've been here for almost 3 years now, as of 2024. It's not great, but it's cheap, and at this point, cheap is all that matters. The neighborhood is rough. There's trash in the streets. It floods during rainy season. But my room costs $300 a month, and that's what my budget allows. Current financial snapshot. Savings. $18,000, down from $28,000 when I separated from Tessalin. Monthly income, $1,800 from Social Security, plus approximately $600 from freelance work equals $2,400 total. Property owned, none debt. None, at least I manage that. My monthly expenses now: room rent, $300, food, $400, utilities and internet, $80, transportation, $60, medical, and miscellaneous, $200. Total, $1,040. That means I'm finally able to save about $1,360 a month if I'm very careful. It's the first time in 5 years I've been able to save anything. At this rate, I might build my savings back up to $40,000 or $50,000 in a few years, which would give me a tiny safety net again. I started with $250,000. I could have had a comfortable retirement with about $2,500 a month passive income if I'd invested it properly and stayed in America. But I don't think you can look back at things and wonder too hard what would have been if I did things differently. That way lies insanity. My daily life now: I wake up around 6. I make instant coffee in my room with a small electric kettle. I work on my laptop for a few hours doing CAD drawings for clients I find on Upwork and other freelance sites. I take a break around lunch, walk to the nearby carinderia, and get rice and whatever meat they have for 50 pesos. I work more in the afternoon. In the evening, I watch YouTube videos or talk to other expats online in forums. I go to bed around 10. It's boring. It's lonely. But it's stable, which is more than I could say during my marriage. I am making peace with it slowly. I'm not happy, but I'm not in crisis mode anymore either. I have enough. That has to be good enough. What happened to Teslin? I do know now that my wife, she is still my wife on paper technically because we never finalized a divorce, is still living in the Manila apartment as far as I know. She has tried to contact me a few times over the years asking for money, saying her family has emergencies, saying the house in Leyte needs repairs. I block her number every time she gets a new one. She would have been in a lot better position if she'd just been honest with me from the start, but she wasn't, and therefore, she's not. My perspective on the Philippines. The Philippines itself is a beautiful country, and I'm sure, in fact, I'm guaranteed that there are real and genuine people here and there, are genuine relationships between foreigners and Filipinos. But there are also people like Teslin who see older foreign men as walking ATMs to be drained systematically. I'm not saying everybody's like that. In fact, I know most people aren't. But there are enough like her that every expat I know has a similar story or knows someone who does. I'm telling this story because I want other people out there, other guys out there, to know what can happen. How easy it could be to lose $244,000 when you think with, let's just call it your heart instead of your head. I didn't think I was naive. I was a grown man in my 60s. I'd worked for 4 decades. I thought I knew better. But I got played right from the start just as easily as anyone else. Watch for these warning signs. When family requests start small and escalate, it started at $500 for grandmother's medicine. Within a year, it was $5,000 for emergencies every few months. Set a firm monthly budget for family support and stick to it. Don't make exceptions. When she pushes to put property in her name because you're a foreigner, find another way or don't buy. Rent instead. Keep your money liquid and in your control. When business investments are suggested, unless you can afford to lose every penny, don't fund businesses in someone else's name in a country where you have no legal recourse. When expenses don't match what you're seeing, if you send $90,000 for a house and it looks like a $30,000 house, demand documentation immediately. If she can't produce receipts, you have your answer. When she changes after marriage, if she was sweet and undemanding while dating but becomes entitled and demanding after marriage, that's not cultural adjustment. That's the real person showing up now that she's secured her position. If you see any of these warning signs, walk away immediately. Don't make excuses. Don't rationalize. Don't convince yourself you're different. You're not. I wasn't. Don't put property in her name. Don't fund family businesses. And most importantly, don't ignore red flags because you're lonely and want to believe someone loves you. The cost of that belief is your entire retirement. 5 years ago, I thought I was building a retirement paradise in the Philippines. I thought I'd have a beautiful house in the province, a loving wife, a comfortable life where my money would last, and I'd finally be respected instead of invisible. 5 years later, I'm in a boarding house in Quezon City, working at 68 years old, with 18,000 in the bank, instead of the 240,000 I started with. I've seen so many people, since 2016, come to the Philippines with all the best intentions in the world, fall in love with someone half their age, fund their entire family's lifestyle, thinking it's an investment, and they're the ones who have to work into their 70s because they have nothing left. The fact that I still have my Social Security, that I didn't lose absolutely everything, that I'm not one of the guys begging for money in expat Facebook groups, that's got to be good enough for me. I'm not in a new relationship. I don't trust Filipinas anymore, to be honest. That probably makes me sound bitter and racist, but it's the truth. I've been burned too badly to try again. Some expats do fine. Some find genuine relationships. I'm happy for them, but I'm not taking that risk again. The Philippines was the country that I always dreamed would give me the retirement I'd worked for. It was a country I wanted to call home, and I thought with the right partner and the right approach, I could build something real. I quickly realized that for every genuine person, there are 10 who see foreign retirees as resources to be exploited until there's nothing left. I thought I was helping Tesselin's family build a better life, but they just left me with nothing and moved on to the next opportunity. Even after all that happened, I don't entirely regret coming here. I learned some hard lessons about trust, about cultural differences, about protecting yourself financially. Could have learned them cheaper, but I learned them. Just make better decisions than I did if you want to live in Southeast Asia. Set boundaries, protect your assets, and don't believe anyone who says age is just a number when there's $250,000 on the table. You have been warned.